Good evening, and thank you all for coming down, taking the trouble on this quiet Sunday evening at the middle of the Shera to attend this lecture. Thank you all to all the people who may or may not have logged in on the live streaming platform which is being sent out through Zoom. And of course, thank you Advaita for that very nice introduction to Satish Chandra. My name is Alok Chandra. I'm the eldest son of late Professor Satish Chandra. My younger brother Akhil joins me from Jakarta in bidding you all welcome to this 6th memorial lecture. And of course, we miss our middle brother, Akhil Sunil, who passed away in 1999. The idea of instituting an annual lecture in the memory of a late father came from one of his associates, Professor Harbans Mukhia from Delhi University. And the lectures are held on the date of his death anniversary, which is 13th of October every year. The previous lectures have been 2019 by Professor Irfan Habib, Reading Medieval India with Professor Satish Chandra, which was done live at the India International Center in Delhi. In 2020, we had COVID, and so we had resorted to a Zoom telecast by Professor Romila Thapar, and the topic was Migrations and the Making of Cultures in Early India. In 21, there was the writer Manu Pillai, who talked about, also on Zoom, who talked about rethinking the princely states, and his very popular book and books are available on Amazon. In 2022, there was Dr. Rajiv Kindra from Northwestern University, also on Zoom, and he talked about the enduring legacy of Mughal pluralism. With the lifting of COVID restrictions in 2023 last year, we brought down Dr. Mridula Mukherjee, also from the JNU at some stage, and the topic that she spoke upon was, is India today the Swaraj of Mahatma Gandhi's dreams, which was held here on this very auditorium live. And all the speakers that you may notice are all historians, because after all, that's what Professor Chandra was known for. I have the privilege of introducing a speaker who was also recommended by Professor Harbans Mukhia. Dr. Pratyay Nath is Associate Professor of History at Ashoka University. He is a historian of early modern South Asia with a focus on the Mughal Empire. He works at the intersection of environmental history, military history, imperial history, and the history of kingship. He is the author of the book Climate of Conquest, War, Environment, and Empire in Mughal North India, and co-editor of The Early Modern in South Asia, Querying Modernity, Periodization, and History. Dr. Nath is also one of the editors of the Medieval History Journal. His current projects include co-editing a volume on the history of the horse in South Asia for Cambridge University Press. He writes in English and Bangla, and lives in New Delhi and Calcutta. He taught formally at Miranda House, Delhi, and St. Stephen's College. So without further delay, I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing Professor Pratyay Nath. Professor.
Very good evening to everybody. I'll begin with what the vocalist musicians say when they go up to the stage, that today my voice is not that great, but hopefully you'll forgive me for that, and nevertheless I'll try to entertain you today. Let me begin by sincerely thanking the family of late Professor Satish Chandra, especially his son, Mr. Alok Chandra, and daughter-in-law, Mridul Chandra, for having me here today. It's a sincere privilege to be delivering this lecture in front of you. I did not know Professor Satish Chandra personally, but I grew up reading his works. Like many of my generation, his numerous books and articles on the history of the Mughal Empire and of medieval India inspired generations and definitely inspired me as a scholar. as I also traveled these parts of the history of the Mughal Empire. Hence, it is for me a matter of great honor and privilege to be delivering this lecture in his memory. In his long and illustrious career, Professor Satish Chandra was not only an eminent historian, he was also an eminent administrator, he was an institution builder. So when Mr. Alok Chandra approached me, invited me to deliver this lecture, I hesitated. I thought, would I find a topic that would do justice to the memory of such a great historian? My hesitation also stemmed from the fact that the list of previous speakers in this series includes the likes of Professor Irfan Habib and Professor Romila Thapar, who are the who's who of South Asian history. But nevertheless, I agreed because two things. One is that I thought that this might be an opportunity for me to pay tribute to such a great historian. And two is that he also, something that I realized afresh by reading his biographies, he was one of the co-founders of my alma mater, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. So I thought that these are reasons enough for me to agree to sort of share a slice of my research with you today. What I talk about today, a people's history of the Mughal Empire, in ways are inspired by the kind of stuff that Professor Satish Chandra wrote. And I would like to begin by showing you a painting, and through that give you a glimpse of how the history writing of the Mughal Empire has evolved in the last 100 years, where Professor Satish Chandra came in all of that, and where I see myself in that long trajectory of history writing. This is the painting. It was painted at the court of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan in about 1635. It's a painting that was included in the manuscript of Shah Jahan's official biography, Badshah Nama. If you look at the top part of the painting, you see Shah Jahan, who is still a prince in this particular moment of history. He is still Prince Khurram. He has recently led a successful campaign against the Rajput Principality of Mewar as a prince, as a military commander, and he has come back to the Mughal court, where he is being greeted by his father, the fourth Mughal emperor, Jahangir. Jahangir is the person at the center of the painting in the orange robes. And it shows the Mughal court, and it shows various people involved in all of that. Now, very quickly, I'll take you through the three main sections of the painting, and through that, how we can understand the evolution of history writing of the Mughal Empire. For the longest period, till about the middle of the 20th century, historians mainly focused on emperors. And these were the initial colonial historians, many of whom were administrators, officials, but wrote about the Indian past. And also the first generations of Indian historians, like Jadunath Sarkar and many other people. When they tried to understand and analyze the Mughal Empire, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them chose to do that by reconstructing the lives of Mughal emperors. So as if the top portion of this painting, it gives us an idea of what the field of history looked like till about 1950s. And at this point of time, there came a new generation of historians, of whom Professor Satish Chandra was a part, who changed this focus. And for the first time since the late 50s, historians of a newer generation started studying the nobility. Professor Satish Chandra's magnum opus, a book that we still remember him for, Parties and Politics at the Mughal Court, 1707 to 1740. He published in 1959. Along with that, the works of Professor Irfan Habib, published in 1963, and the work of Professor Satish Chandra's student, M. Atahar Ali, 1966. These three books and these three historians, they changed the landscape of Mughal history. At one go, the focus shifted from the emperors to the nobility. And they talked less about political facts and military events and battles, more popular with the previous generations of historians, and focused more and more on what we call the social history of the empire. Social processes, economic processes. Why were there lobbies inside the nobility? What were they fighting for? Were these lobbies consolidated around religion or ethnicity? Or were the interest groups, people who would stick together and fight towards the fulfillment of shared political goals? And all of that, since Professor Satish Chandra's book in 1959, it changed the landscape of the empire in such a way that this was a tectonic shift in our understanding of the empire. Historiography, of course, has proceeded from there since then. And what I would like to do today is shift to the bottom section of the painting. Because in the same painting, at the very end, towards the very bottom, we find a different set of people who were not emperors or princes, who were not even noblemen or whom we call mansabdars or jagirdars. These were people further down the social rungs. These were people like that guy on the elephant. These were people taking care of the elephant, of various animals. These were people fighting on foot for the empire. These were people pitching the tents or cutting down trees so that the army could proceed. These were people not fighting on horseback because they were poorer, and they fought on foot. So in what follows, maybe in the course of the next half an hour or so, I'll briefly talk about these two groups of people. People who we can call common infantry or foot soldiers, who mainly fought as wrestlers, as guards, as gunners, as foot soldiers in various capacities. And I will talk about the various workers who toiled in the logistical core of Mughal armies. I'll show you some more sections of Mughal paintings to sort of help all of us visualize what that Mughal world might have looked like for these very common people who were involved in the imperial project, so as to say. I would also like to begin by telling you why I find this exercise worthwhile. See, I'm a historian of Mughal warfare. And till now, a major part of my work has been how warfare interacts with environment. As the Mughals were, for example, going across the length and breadth of South Asia, were they fighting in the same way? Or did fighting techniques change because the places were different? In North India, for example, they found these large spaces, open fields, where they could run around with their large cavalry armies. In central India or Deccan, where we are right now, more hilly terrain, plateau ecology, more dry ground. Did the Mughals fight in the same way here? How did they negotiate the rivers and the rains and the floods in the areas of eastern India, where I come from? So a large part of my work deals with this kind of adaptation that the Mughals did. And I argue that wherever the Mughals went, they adapted to the local conditions and they adjusted their ways of fighting. In doing all of this, increasingly as I looked at the Mughal Empire, as I looked at armies of the Mughal Empire, I realized that for a long time, even though the focus has shifted from emperors, we still have a lot to know about the common people, beyond the rungs of the nobles, who we now do know quite a lot about, thanks to historians like Professor Satish Chandra. I also realized that while a lot of historians who work on war focus on battles, focus on cannons roaring, that's not all that there is to warfare. If we think of movies about the Mughals, Mughal-e-Azam, for example, or Jodha Akbar, we find that a lot of that screen time is taken up by these battles where we see knights in shining armor riding and cannons roaring and elephants running. Unfortunately, a lot of historians who study warfare also keep that at their focus, the glamorous part of war. But what drew me more were the less glamorous sides of war. Compare the two things. On the one hand, keep the Mughal nobleman in shining armor charging at the enemy, maybe shooting arrows from horseback, maybe with a sword unsheathed, maybe charging with a lance, and he clashes with another horseman. And there is a glamour to that. And now contrast that to the life of a logistical worker at a siege, an attempt to conquering a fort, a siege where an army would remain encamped for months. In the famous siege of Chittor, for example, Akbar's army was encamped for 6 months from 1567 to 68. And a lot of the war or battle was not about knights charging at each other, noblemen charging at each other, but people digging trenches or saps or mines, trying to get close to the fort so that they can attack the fort. They had to work through the mud, much like soldiers had to do in the First World War, the ultimate war of trenches. So if we shift our focus from these relatively glamorous battles to the other forms of warfare, warfare that entailed remaining camped at a site and trying to take a fort through an arduous siege month after month, by digging the ground, by helping the soldiers gradually approach the fort. Or fighting wars among the rivers of Bengal, where a large part of the military campaigns were the boatmen who rowed the boats which the Mughals used to fight their military campaigns. So in the next 25 minutes or so now, I'll very briefly go through some of these visuals to help us illustrate this world of commoners like me, and probably also many of you. The main argument that I would lay in front of you are twofold. First, that vast sections of common people were important in Mughal military campaigns, and thereby the processes of empire building. And secondly, their participation shows that the Mughal Empire was a broad-based, collaborative entity and not just an elite project. I promise that that's as much text that I intend to show you, and the remaining part are not, they don't have any text at all. I begin with the first group, the foot soldiers. They were of all kinds. And in the Mughal documents, it is possible to recover some of the details of who these people were. We know about, for example, how many kinds of infantrymen they were. Akbar's best friend, who he also conveniently hired to be his biographer, Abul Fazl, a Mughal political ideologue, he wrote at length about the Mughal Empire, and in one of the administrative compendiums that he wrote, he details all the different kinds of soldiers, including the various kinds of foot soldiers. So from him, for example, we know about this category that he calls Peyadagan, which could refer to guards, but which could also refer to foot soldiers in general. Now, he was very generous with this category. He not only included soldiers, but he also included wrestlers. Now one might pause and add and ask that, are wrestlers really soldiers? And one might answer, why not? Because when the empire is not at war, but there is still a thriving military culture at court, the wrestlers would keep it alive. Abul Fazl tells us that Akbar apparently wrestled with elephants. And wrestling was a regular thing that the Mughals and all different kings of the times would regularly have at their court. So even when people were not fighting, the military culture would be kept alive by people like wrestlers. But there were other people. We know, for example, of gladiators or swordsmen, whom Abul Fazl calls Shamsherbaz. We know about how much they were paid, and I'm not going into the figures. We know that they were classified on the basis of their expertise, their skill level, the nature of their skill. Some people who would fight with bare hands, some people who would fight with swords, some people who would fight with spears, and sometimes this had a regional specialization angle to it as well. And there would be communities who would be preferred, or at least they would be famous for the skills that they would bring in. What we see in this painting, and this is a painting from a slightly earlier period. This is a painting from Akbar's biography, Akbarnama. It was painted around 1590 to the very large biography of Akbar that Abul Fazl wrote. These paintings were illustrative, and they illustrated different events of Akbar's life. This painting illustrates the siege of Chittor. 67-68. It shows Akbar's army invading the fort. The fort is the orange structure that we see on the top left. And the remaining part of the painting is entirely Mughal soldiers trying to get into the fort. Now, what they have built here is what in English we call a sap, what the Mughals in Persian used to call a sabat. It would be a zigzag pathway to help the soldiers approach the fort without getting shot. So this painting, especially in all these details, give us a view of what Mughal foot soldiers looked like. See, sieges were a sphere where horsemen were hardly present, because soldiers had to remain encamped there for days, for weeks, for months, trying to capture the fort. So what we see, and this is a close-up from the same painting, are many foot soldiers. We see people with spears. We see people with guns. We see people with bows and arrows. Many of them carry shields. They're all urging each other to go inside the fort and storm the fort, as they did in early 1568. This is another part of the painting. This gives us a flavor of what we find in the literary texts. The Mughals produced a lot of literary texts, biographies, imperial chronicles, dynastic histories and all. And all of that gives us a glimpse of this world that it's easy to gloss over, but the paintings sort of help us visualize this very, very rich and important world of the non-elite, the common soldiers. This is another painting from much later. This is a painting of the siege of Udgir. It's from during the reign of Shah Jahan, once again. And we see, again, two sections of the painting. The first one is at the bottom of the painting. Always something that the painters were interested in painting, because the aristocrats on horses. And this would be the mainstay of a lot of things that the chroniclers would talk about, or the painters would be interested in drawing. And we see a lot of the elite mounted soldiers involved in this act of siege. And we see the fort surrendering, soldiers coming out of the fortress, surrendering to the Mughal general and all of that. But I would draw your attention to the middle part of the painting. Once again, like the painting from the siege of Chittor, we see a lot of foot soldiers of every description. People with bows and arrows, people with spears, people with guns. What this means is that the Mughal artists were cognizant about the very visible role that these foot soldiers fulfilled on the battlefield. What was their role, one may ask? If cavalry was there, leading cavalry charges against the enemy, what role did these foot soldiers have? One would have to say very many. Large numbers of these soldiers were easier to hire and cheaper to hire. They were paid in cash. And most of these people were part-time soldiers. Many of them were farmers who, during the off-season of agriculture, which conveniently happened to be the season of military campaigning, the winter months, where it's not that hot or that rainy in South Asia, and it's possible to conduct military campaigns. Farmers would go into armies as part-time soldiers. They would bring their own weapons, bows and arrows, even guns. And they would join whichever army was willing to pay them. The Mughals hired a lot of these peasants. But not just the Mughals, Rajputs, Afghans of the times, we know that they were also hiring these people. Now, where they became particularly important were places where cavalry could not meet each other in a battle. Imagine, for example, the siege of Chittor. This was not a battle where cavalry could charge at each other. Here, on the one hand, the troops were inside the fort, and there were other troops trying to get inside the fort, and they had to fight each other from a distance. This is where infantry became very, very important, because archers, foot soldiers could shoot their arrows, could shoot their guns from a distance. And we see the same thing when the Mughals fought among the rivers in Bengal, in Assam, in Sindh. They fought in boats. And it was not possible to deploy cavalry on boats. So they deployed a lot of foot soldiers, archers, gunners, matchlockmen. Matchlocks were these early versions of rifles. So in different kinds of wars that the Mughals fought, the soldiers who fought on foot become visible repeatedly. So what is the main argument here? It is that these soldiers were militarily important. If we study only technology, as some historians have, it's easy to get carried away by how good Mughal cannons look. And many historians have stressed how great technology the Mughals had in terms of guns and cannons. What I try to ask is that it is true that the Mughals had a lot of cannons, but were they actually useful in their battles? And there my answer is only partly. Beyond the cannons, there were other factors that helped the Mughals win their wars, and foot soldiers played a very important role. When they had to capture fort after fort, think of the Deccan, for example. Aurangzeb camped here for 25 years, trying to capture Bijapur and Golconda and eventually Jinji. And in all these sieges, foot soldiers, not so much cavalry, but foot soldiers, played a very, very crucial role. What I am not going into in this lecture are the details of what kind of payments they received, how these people were recruited in the armies, what kind of position they had in the armies, etc. This is what I was talking about in terms of the Mughals fighting on boats. This is again a painting from the Akbarnama, painted around 1590. And it shows Mughals fighting their enemies on a river. Now this river is in North India, the battle from the 1560s. And I will use this to not only show again the foot soldiers in action, the archers and the gunners, we see them busy in action. But let me also use this painting to go over to the second group that I want to talk about, which is people who were not soldiers, but laborers of various kinds. What we see in these boats, 3, the three boats that we see here, are not just the soldiers, but also the boatmen. Often Mughal chronicles, the biographies that the Mughals got commissioned and written, they focus on the achievements of, as I was talking about, the noble soldiers, but also the foot soldiers. What they talk even less about are the other forms of workers. And this painting allows us to envision what that other realm of work might have looked like. The boatmen, who became so very important in wars in riverine areas. Wherever the Mughals had to fight on boats, the boatmen became tremendously important. And I will come back to the boatmen at the very end of the lecture as well. But in the meantime, we move over to the depiction of a different siege. Again, a painting from Akbarnama. A lot of action is going on regarding the capture of a fort. And of course, it is easy to get attracted by the various guns that are being fired here. But I would draw your attention again to the bottom part of the painting that exposes a different realm of war. This is the zoomed in version. This is not the domain of emperors for sure. This is not the domain of noblemen. This is not even the domain of foot soldiers. As common as those foot soldiers were, this is the domain of even more non-elite, poorer sections of South Asian people. Masons, carpenters, skilled labor and unskilled labor, preparing battlements which the Mughals needed to defend their position, even as they were attacking the fort in front of them. If we look closely, we see laborers of various kinds, and it is possible to understand that there are different kinds of laborers through the different kinds of work they are doing, and through the different kinds of garments that they are wearing or not wearing. It is probably possible to identify some of the workers who were the more skilled laborers, who were actually doing the construction work. Some of the workers who were probably less skilled, who were mainly carrying rubble. And then some of the supervisors, very angry, stick-wielding supervisors, making sure that the work is going on. So in the various descriptions of sieges, wherever the Mughals would go to capture fortresses, we not only find mentions of foot soldiers firing their arrows and their guns, but we also get references to this kind of work that they would conduct. And then the paintings help us visualize this realm of work. This, another favorite painting of mine, is a depiction of the construction of the Agra fort that Akbar got constructed in Agra. It is a painting from the same set of manuscripts, Akbarnama, commissioned around 1590, and it helps us visualize again the background processes that went on behind the masterpiece that we see in front of us even today. This is probably one of those paintings that show a very, very diverse range of laborers. People constructing the fortress, again, carrying rubble, rocks, etc. We also see women in action. So while the actual chronicles of the Mughals talk very little about laborers in general, I have personally found no mention to women laborers. But somehow they have slipped in through the cracks of the paintings and made their appearances in this alternate set of sources for us to look into the Mughal world. Once again, we find the figures of the supervisor, several actually. This is the middle part of the painting. Not only various actions like transport, like the cutting of rocks, the carrying of rocks, etc., and other things going on with the construction process. But we also see a shopkeeper here weighing things, because after all these people need to eat. And alongside all of this business that would go on for years, the construction venture, regular life would go on. And we find references to these transactions being carried on the side of the actual army, where soldiers would need the various kinds of raw materials for their sustenance. What I would also like to point out, which I'm not going into today, is the world of the non-humans, the animals, which repeatedly make appearance both in chronicles and in paintings. And this is some ongoing work that I'm doing right now to think about the Mughal Empire through the lens of non-human animals, the elephants, the horses, both of which took part in battles, but also the bullocks, the camels, the mules, which carried burden as beasts of burden, animals that were exchanged in the gift economy of the empire, animals that were hunted, the lion and the tiger, etc. So what does the Mughal Empire look like if we study it not from the perspective of humans, whether they are elite or non-elite, but what does the empire look like if we study it from the lens of animals? That's a part of the ongoing work, but for now I'll keep the focus on the people of the empire. And that brings us to the bottom section of the painting. Once again, see how the painter very carefully is giving us an idea again of other forms of labor, the bhisti, for example, at the bottom, filling up leather bags with water, or the washerman, whose work is probably not directly related to the construction work, but like the work of the shopkeeper, it is the work of people like the washerman that kept things going. In fact, here I would like you to imagine what a Mughal camp might look like. In fact, this construction work of the fortress, which went on for several years, it was still a temporary venture. But if you think of the Mughal camp, which would travel across the length and breadth of South Asia with thousands of soldiers, sometimes hundreds of thousands of soldiers, imagine for a moment what that camp might look like. And I will read out a couple of lines in translation from Abul Fazl about how he describes the imperial camp of Akbar. He writes that each such encampment would be serviced by, and I quote, 1,000 farashes, natives of Iran, Turan, Hindustan, 500 pioneers, these were the beldaran, or the people who would work with shovels to make the ground flat. There would be 100 water carriers, 50 carpenters, tent makers and torch bearers, 30 workers in leather, and 150 sweepers. And this is just one imperial camp. And Abul Fazl says that, of course, there were two sets of camps. So when the Badshah is camped in one location, another set of tents would be sent over to the advanced location, which would be set up, ready for the Badshah to move in when he would reach there the next day. And now think of it as not just as a camp of the emperor, but a large army. Think, for example, of an army that Shah Jahan sent to the siege of Kandahar in 1649. This was an army of 60,000 soldiers. His chroniclers say that there were 50,000 cavalry and 10,000 foot soldiers of various kinds. Immediately when I say 50,000 cavalry, we are not talking just about humans, but also about a similar number of horses. And now let us imagine that alongside these two types of soldiers and horses and elephants which were sent, there were other animals on which supplies were carried. So camels, bullocks, which also numbered into hundreds and thousands. And now think about the various people taking care of all of these people, humans and the non-humans, animals. There would be people needed to cook, to chop vegetables, to wash the dishes, to bring the firewood, source the firewood every single day so that food could be cooked. There would be people who would have to go out to source the fodder or the grass that the animals would feed on. They would need carpenters, they would need barbers, they would need people adept at textiles, and various other kinds of specialization that a community can think of. These camps were no less than moving cities. So for a group of soldiers who numbered up to 60,000, the number of people in the camp would actually be much, much larger. And as a very close friend of mine once asked me, she researches the work of manual scavengers in colonial Calcutta in the 1930s and 40s, Maria. She asked me that, were there also manual scavengers in the Mughal Empire? Because if we are thinking of an army that is 60,000 strong, and including all the other people and the animals, it's in lakhs, the number. Every day they must be producing a mountain of excreta. And if such an army would be encamped in a place for even one day, the quantity of that excreta would be tremendous. And if left untreated, it would spread a lot of infectious diseases. And entire armies would get wiped away. Now we do know that the Mughal armies did not frequently get wiped out like this. Which means that there were people cleaning these excreta. But when my friend asked me this question, I did not have an answer. Because the Mughal sources do not say anything at all about how this human and non-human excreta was treated. I did not have an answer. But I knew that there were people, probably from the most bottom rungs of society, probably Dalits, who were doing this task meticulously so that entire armies were actually not getting wiped out by the kind of mountain loads of excreta that was getting produced every day, which had a high chance of producing infectious diseases. So while our sources, both the literary texts and these visual images, help us imagine this world of human labor and non-human labor, there are more people who we cannot envision because our documents do not give us that information. But we know that they were there, toiling behind the scenes, but getting unnoticed by the very, very elite chroniclers that were writing the Mughal chronicles. The last painting that I would like to show you is very close to my heart. Also from the Akbarnama. This is a glimpse of the siege of Ranthambore. 1569, Akbar encamped there with his army for a few months, and he bombarded the fortress with his cannons, and that's what the top part at least of this painting shows. But that's only half the story. There's a backstory to it, which is that when Akbar reached the fort of Ranthambore in western India with his army, he realized that that fortress is on top of a hill. And although he has cannons with him, if he fires those cannons from the plain land, the cannon shots won't reach the fort. So to counter that fortress on top of an elevation, a hill, he needed his cannons to be mounted on another elevation opposite to it. That is the elevation we see in the painting. This is another hillock that the Mughals were able to spot in front of the main fortress of Ranthambore. And they dragged the cannons up the slopes of the hill of Ran, as it was called. And they successfully deployed the cannons from there. Now it's very easy once again to get bedazzled by the shine of these Mughal cannons, or to be deafened by the roar of the cannons as they were being fired, or the walls as they were getting shattered. But I would like to draw your attention to what this painting very evocatively shows up, which is how the cannons landed up there in the first place. They were dragged up there. And Abul Fazl writes 2 sentences about this, of how iron-armed workers sort of pulled these cannons up, and how they were aided by these oxen. That is exactly what this painting shows us. 3 detailed areas of the painting. The first one on the left, people pushing from the back, the cannon, all of them. We also find soldiers, so it's not just laborers, but also soldiers with guns, foot soldiers, not the noblemen. God forbid the noblemen should help out with something like this, but definitely the foot soldiers were called upon to help out with these activities. We also see 2 carriages. If we go back, we see 2 carriages. One is here the main bullock cart. Of course, there are several bullocks harnessed to it. And this is the driver, and I will go to the zoomed in version in a moment. And then there is this gun carriage, a large cannon, and it was fitted onto these carriages with wheels. So now if we go on to the zoomed in versions, we see that on the top left version, we see the gun carriage, and a man sitting there drumming up the pace, literally. And ethnomusicologist Bonnie Wade has sort of made us aware of how the Mughal paintings have a certain sound to it. In different paintings, we see, armies clashing and people beating the drums at the background and horses going around and elephants roaring. And she points out that you can listen to Mughal paintings. And I would point out that probably this is something we can do very palpably in this painting. All the various kinds of, I'm not finding the word, but the collective pronouncements that the workers would do when they would do some heavy lifting. It's as if we can hear it in this painting. We can hear the person drumming it up as he encourages everybody to push. And the middle part of the painting, the cart and the cart driver who is driving the bullocks and the oxen in front of him. And we already see people who are tugging at the ropes which are fastened to the cannon. And finally, the final version, the top version of the painting, we see all the taut ropes being pulled by the men in front. Once again, we see soldiers. For example, this guy has a gun slung on his back. But we also see regular workers, some of them visibly very poor, some of them less so. Some clad, some unclad. But together, what both the chronicles tell us and what the painting shows us is that they achieved a tremendous task of pulling these extremely, extremely heavy 16th century cannons up the slope of the mountains, which may, hill, not mountain to be fair, which may appear small in this painting, but must have been much larger. And it is thanks to their effort. And once again, it is impossible to miss the role of the animals here. It would be, as I'm talking about the people's history of the Mughal Empire, it would be a mistake not to note the role of the non-humans who also performed or participated in the very, very crucial task of achieving this tremendous feat of dragging these extremely heavy cannons. Before ending and going back to my conclusions, I would sort of reflect on what all of this comes up to. After all, what I have done in the last half an hour is sort of describe to you what this world of labor, common laborers, common workers, common foot soldiers of the Mughal army might have looked like. What sort of work they might have been doing. But I also want to spend a couple of minutes on the implications of this kind of work. The first I would say, and here I can So this is the first part, the first point I've covered. And now I would like to go on to the second point, what their participation shows. You see, for a long time, as I was saying in the beginning, we understood the Mughal Empire primarily in terms of emperors. As many historians wrote imperial biographies, biographies of Akbar, biographies of Babur, etc. Very interestingly, biography writing has become very popular again in the last 10 years. Many people, especially people who are based in the US, have been writing imperial biographies of imperial figures. Not just emperors, but also princesses and princes. People like Dara Shikoh, people like Gulbadan Begum, people like Noor Jahan. Now all of them have their biographies, and that was very needed. And in a way, these historians look at the biography in a different perspective. They don't say that the Mughal Empire was all about the emperors, but rather they use the conversation about the emperors to talk about various facets of the empire. Alongside that, what people like Professor Satish Chandra did was make us aware about the various rungs of the nobility. Not everybody of the nobility was rich. There were senior mansabdars who formed the inner circle of the emperor, but there were also junior mansabdars who had their own struggles. And through the work of Satish Chandra, Athar Ali, we know about this world of noblemen. My discussion shows that the ambit of the empire went even broader than the various sections of nobility, who at the end of the day was only a small fraction of the population of South Asia, which was much larger. What this discussion shows is that if thousands of foot soldiers, thousands of farmers who were part-time foot soldiers, they were a part of imperial armies. If hundreds of woodcutters and masons and carpenters and all were parts of the military expeditions, then this was a very broad-based empire that would hire a lot of different kinds of people. After all, remember that there were no paved roads in the Mughal Empire. So whenever the Mughal army had to go somewhere to fight wars, it had to make its own paths. A part of that sometimes could entail cutting down parts of forests to clear out a path. Who would do that work? Woodcutters. So often in front of the main army, a group of woodcutters would proceed, chopping down some of the trees and creating a path. In places, and that happened, for example, in the Aravalli forests or in Assam. In other parts, for example, when the armies went to Afghanistan or Kashmir, where the land is rugged, they needed pioneers or road builders to proceed in front, leveling the ground, sometimes throwing bridges over streams and rivers so that the main army could pass. So all of this means that people of a variety of expertise, and of course not to forget of the animal handlers of various kinds, people who were selling the animals, maintaining thousands of elephants and horses and cattle and mules and camels in the imperial stables all around the year. The various people who were manufacturing the cannons, manufacturing the guns, manufacturing, guarding the other kinds of weapons and armaments that were there. All of this meant that people of diverse set of expertise was needed. It's not just soldiers, certainly not just elite soldiers. So what I argue, and here of course I'm not alone, but I draw upon the works of other people like Farhat Hassan, Chetan Singh and others, who have also argued that the empire at the end of the day was a product of collaborations. It was not a top-heavy empire where emperors thrust everything down on the subject population. But it's only by hiring large parts of the subject population, incorporating them in the imperial structure in various ways, that the empire could function. And interestingly, some historians like Professor Muzaffar Alam have argued that they have sort of explained the disintegration of the Mughal Empire in terms of the failure of these collaborations. So there's a whole set of writings from the late 80s, which I am standing on, which I am drawing upon, which give us this notion of a collaborative empire. Other historians have argued this in other ways. In my work, I argue in terms of the foot soldiers, in terms of the logistical workers. I argue that it is the combined labor of all these various kinds of South Asian people that helped Mughals be militarily successful. And since wars mattered, since a large part of the Mughal success derived from their military success, we can say that the contribution of all of these common people, common folk, was central to not just war, but to the entire project of empire building as a whole. Before closing, I would like to narrate an incident as a sort of epilogue to all of this. When we think of the Mughal Empire, when we are reading about it, when we are watching it on screen in terms of movies or TV series, we think of the empire as a powerful entity. I'll tell you a story which sort of allows us to see it in a slightly different light. The year is around 1608, and the Mughals were campaigning in my part of the world, East Bengal. It's a land of rivers. By this time, the Mughals had been in Bengal for quite some time, so they knew that this is a land of rivers. They can't fight just on horseback. Even common foot soldiers is not enough, but they have to fight on boats, like the painting that I showed you here. They had to fight on boats. So this was one particular campaign, and they were going to subdue one particular chieftain. They were facing a lot of difficulty in defeating. This was Musa Khan. He was stationed somewhere in eastern Bengal, and the Mughals were trying to apprehend him. They were, by this time, the Mughals were, as I said, fighting with a lot of boats. They had about 300 boats, big and small, in their fleet. We often wonder if the Mughals had a fleet. They did. Not a seafaring fleet, but they had riverine fleets. So in this particular instance, the Mughals were going down one of the smaller rivers of East Bengal, and the 300 war boats carried guns, they carried soldiers, they carried cannons. They also carried about 13,000 boatmen and crew. On whom was the responsibility of rowing the boats? This is a painting from a different conflict, but nevertheless, the images can be evocative. 12 or 13,000 boatmen and crew who were in charge of rowing the boats, manning the cannons, loading the cannons up, getting them down, and all of these manual chores. One fine morning, and there's a chronicle from Bengal around this time called Baharistan-e-Ghaibi, which was written by a commander who was part of this campaign. And he writes that we were doing quite all right. We were going down the river, and the mood was upbeat that we are going to defeat this Afghan chieftain. Suddenly, one fine morning, everybody realized that the fleet has come to a standstill. And immediately there was a scramble. Everybody started inquiring, asking what happened. And they realized that out of the 12 or 13,000 boatmen, most had fled. And again, there was another set of questions. What happened? What happened? And then it emerged that people had forgotten to pay their salary. And they had basically struck work and deserted. Here was the mighty fleet of the mighty Mughal Empire, stranded in the backwaters of eastern Bengal. Not because some mighty enemy had defeated them, but the lowest of their subject population, the boatmen, often historically have been Muslims or have been lower caste Hindus. they had hamstrung the empire. And Mirza Nathan, the author of this chronicle, he says that he was, quite a quandary because his father, Ihtimam Khan, was in charge of the entire campaign. So his reputation and his family's reputation was at stake. So immediately there was a scramble and people started sending people to different localities to fetch boatmen. Thankfully, it being a land of rivers, there was no dearth of boatmen, and they managed to get some people on board, and only after that, not 12 or 13,000, much less, but still with the very minimum numbers, the fleet started moving. Eventually, the Mughals won the campaign. But for us, this moment is very important, because in contrast to the bulk of the histories that we read or we even write, or the kind of portrayals of the Mughal Empire that we are used to through popular media, this is a very different picture. It shows the empire as a vulnerable entity, vulnerable not to any mighty enemy, but vulnerable to the common man. For me, this is a very poignant example of a section of people who are relatively neglected in history writing, but who were equally important, if not in their presence, certainly in their absence. I stop here. Thank you very much. It has been a privilege.
We'll now take questions from any members of the audience who care to talk, to ask. So if you can raise your hands, I will start with the gentleman in the front.
Hi, Asif here. So I have a question. I was born and raised in Shillong. So growing up, heard a lot of Battle of Saraighat, the Lachit Barphuyya, and I think Rai Singh was the one who represented Mughals, if I correctly remember. So what went wrong? Because they lost. And it was a naval battle. I expected you to touch upon that, but you did not. So I just wanted to know your perspective.
Thank you so much. It's a very important question because it allows me to talk a little bit about the Mughal experience in Assam. As we know, Assam is, like Eastern Bengal, another land of rivers, also full of forests. Now, Mughals struggled quite a lot in Bengal because of the same reasons: forests, rivers, rains, floods, probably also mosquitoes and tigers, but we don't find references of that. But they managed to conquer Bengal. Assam, everything was further exacerbated. More rains, more floods. They fought 4 wars there and lost all of them. And more than any military factors, it was, what I have argued in my work, is this constant struggle against nature that got the better of them. The rains and the floods would often snap the supply lines. The familiarity of the Mughals with boats was less than the familiarity of the Ahoms with the boats. So I've argued that the military challenge was substantial, but even more than that, the challenge of coping with all of these environmental factors contributed, not just to their defeat in the Battle of Saraighat, but also the Mughal general failure in Assam.
Take the Shantanu.
You made a brilliant presentation, and your use of the photographs and the painting was an absolutely novel way of communicating with us. Thank you so much. I have one question. And is it appropriate to use the word collaboration? Collaboration means that there is a degree of willingness that people are volunteering. If we stretch this a little bit, could we call the indentured labor during the British time in the indigo and the opium fields, were they also collaborating? So while you made out a very strong case that the entire army, Mughal army, was highly dependent on a very large number of skilled people. Was it collaboration? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Because you have raised a very fundamental question about how to interpret what we are seeing. I would, however, say that the case of indentured labor or enslaved labor is different because legally we do not find any enslaved population in the Mughal Empire. The people that we find were mostly waged. They received a salary, mostly in cash, and Abul Fazl in his administrative documents gives us details. Now, whether or not they were actually followed, we still know that the idea was there as a normative, as a sort of guidelines, that yes, we should strive towards this. I would sort of approach this in two ways. One is that it is possible, as it is often happened in Indian history in caste-based society, that different people have had to fulfill caste-based obligations without salary, which is called begar labor. Now, it is possible that some of the workmen working in the Mughal armies also rendered this labor as a part of the begar labor, although I have not encountered any evidence towards this, but it is possible. But we find repeated examples of this sense of negotiation between workers and the empire. The case of the boatmen being a case in point. That when their conditions were not met, they fled, leaving the empire hamstrung. There are examples where arduous tasks had to be done, and we find that the texts tell us that Mughal commanders were scattering money among the laborers to keep them going. And in one case of Bengal, we all know that we Bengalis are rice-eating people. So they were scattering rice, opium, alongside coins to keep enticing the boatmen of Bengal to do some manual chores. So that is one point I would like to make, that most of these people were not being forced to work for the empire, but they were working in lieu of salary, which could be lucrative for them. Some other historians like Dirk Koll, Fiqtidar Alam Khan have argued that it's possible that some of them were looking at such income to augment their regular income otherwise. The other point I would make is that we at least know for the infantry soldiers, the farmers and part-time soldiers, that fighting for the empire brought them prestige. So it's just not just monetary benefits, but it's also what serving the empire meant for the communities they came from. And over time they built up. So I would say that both of these things meant that increasingly it became lucrative for people to serve the empire. Not just, there were other polities also that they were serving, but after all the Mughals emerged as the most lucrative employer.
Yes, before I'm accused of being partial to the center, that lady from the right. Yes, I'm sorry, gentleman from the right, yes. Yes, yes.
So thank you very much for your lecture. I wondered, so you pointed out that you're in this tradition of a whole shift of the attention of historians from the elites to people further down. I wondered, how much is your lecture a function of this, and how much is actually what I thought you said in the end, actually the Mughal Empire less centralized or less top-down project compared to other empires? Thank you.
Other empires of India or contemporary world empires?
Contemporary, past, India, not India,
Right.
Whatever you can think of. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that question. I would say here that our knowledge about the past is not uniform. We know quite a lot about certain things and absolutely nothing about a lot of things. So more far we go into the past, less and less we know about the common people or the poor people. Because sources mainly were created by the elite, who were literate enough, who had the resources to create these texts. These could be paintings, etc., etc. So compared to the British Empire, for example, and people have written so much about the role of laborers in British colonial empires in South Asia, we know a lot less about the Mughal Empire. And if we go back further in time, we know even less. So if I talk to some of my colleagues who work on earlier periods, they tell me that we simply don't have this kind of information. So that's part of it, but it is also about the intentions of the historians, which keep on shifting based on our own times and the kind of imperatives we feel. I'll give you one example. Environmental history, for example, has become extremely popular in the last 10, 15 years, mainly because we are talking about it. We are realizing that it's doomsday. So generally people have become interested in knowing about how past societies dealt with the environment. So similarly, this idea of getting to know the roles of common people is also not something that was there always. I would say that the generation of Professor Satish Chandra started it for the Mughal Empire and for Indian empires, and some of us are still carrying on that legacy.
Next question, gentleman on the right.
All right, so this is the question that I wanted to ask. I've heard stories about a general who worked for Jahangir called Malik Ambar, and apparently he was a African slave Siddhi, bought and sold. So, can you tell me more? And were slaves and prisoners in war part of this workforce?
Thank you for that question. Here I must say that we are talking about two different forms of slavery. One is the kind of slavery when we think of American plantation labor. African people enslaved and forced to work first in the gold and silver mines in the Americas, and once those mines dried up, in the plantations of tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane in the American South. And this is comparable to slavery in ancient Greece and Rome. People completely dispossessed of everything, given bare minimum for subsistence, and just made to work for the master community. Prisoners of war, in some cases, could be like that, although there's not a lot of evidence towards that for the Mughal Empire. The other kind of slave, of which Malik Ambar was a part, is so different that late Professor Sunil Kumar has argued that we shouldn't even call it slavery. This was a custom in Islamic courts to capture young boys, bring them to the court, and then give them everything. Training in warfare, training in religion, education, training in court etiquette, everything, and train them to take military command, charge of military campaigns. And many of them became sultans. We know about Qutbuddin Aibak, we know about Shamsuddin Iltutmish, Ghiyasuddin Balban. All these so-called Delhi sultans began their career as these so-called military slaves. In what way were they slaves? They had nothing when they started their career. Maybe somebody captured them while in course of a military campaign. Maybe somebody bought them at a slave market. And in that way they were slaves. But the rest of their life, they were very different from the American plantation slaves. Malik Ambar was one such slave from the kingdom of Ahmednagar. And these parts where we are sitting now, the Deccan, received a lot of these military slaves from Africa, East Africa. They came into the Deccan sultanates, the Bahmani sultanates, and Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Golconda, all of them. And even today, the descendants of these African communities survive in cities like Hyderabad. Malik Ambar was one such commander who, for most of his career, was a military slave, but eventually became a very powerful political leader and military commander in the Sultanate of Ahmednagar. In the Mughal Empire, however, we do not find military slaves. But I'll end with this, that the Mughals sort of set the tone of court society in such a way that even noblemen who were free people went about saying, we are just slaves to the great emperor. They used to pride in calling themselves banda, or slave, even when they were not slaves. Sorry. But the status of slavery was sort of elevated to that if you can call yourself a slave, it means that you have arrived.
Next question. Can I take somebody from the back that side, left, gentleman out there?
Thank you. It was a lovely talk. My question was, does the mere fact that the Mughal Empire had a defense industrial complex, does that make it collaborative, right? Lockheed can make spy planes, doesn't make the US DoD collaborative.
Thank you. Also because that ties up with the older question. I would hesitate to use the term military-industrial complex for the 16th century, mainly because it is a term used for a specific context of 20th century American history. But I take the larger point that, there's a collaboration and war becomes, quote unquote, an industry. I would say yes. That would be the simple answer. I would say that even today, it is not just if we are talking about the military industrial complex, which often people now say military entertainment industrial complex, it is not just the labor of people who are making the bombs, who are making all the armaments, propaganda, etc., but it is also the filmmakers of war movies, the makers of military-themed computer games, which create a consensus in our society that war is legitimate, that America is fighting the good war everywhere in the world. I would say that they play a crucial role in legitimizing the war effort of the American military-industrial complex in today's world. And without that legitimization that the entertainment industry is doing, war would not function. So I would not look at these people as just minions, but be it for the American war industry or the Mughal war project, I would say, and this is in the realm of interpretation, my interpretation would be that this is a form of collaboration, where the empire would not be able to do anything, not even crossing a river, not even going from point A to point B, not even feeding the army for a single day, without the labor of all these people. And from that point of view, my interpretation would be that this is definitely a form of collaboration.
Further questions?
Just a few words, with hierarchy. I'm not saying there is no hierarchy. Of course the Mughal state is on top. And those stick-wielding figures in the paintings make us aware of that there were people, agents of the state, wielding those sticks. So it is a collaboration, hierarchical, but collaboration.
The lady out here in the front.
Thank you for that compelling lecture. I have 4 questions. I'm going to keep them as brief as possible. The first is there anything, given the scale of warfare, given the number of wars and so on that were fought, and the success with which the Mughals fought them, was there an innovation that you can attribute to the Mughals along the lines of, say, how the stirrup changes horse warfare and what, Tipu pioneers in the way of the rocket? Is there anything similar in this period that you can think of as a contribution that was innovative? The second question is, you mentioned, for instance, that the roads had to be cleared by the woodsmen and so on and so forth. There was no cartographic knowledge as far as one knows. What were the guiding principles for, obviously the Mughals knew their territory. What were the ways by which they knew their territory, other than cartography? My third question is to do with what is a people's history if there are no women? So you did bring in 1 or 2 instances, but if the sources don't talk about this, has this historiographical absence at all been addressed? Has there been some way in which, historians have tried to approach this question, not just of the court? Obviously you will be able to say some things about the court, but more than that. And lastly, was there a regimental bazaar? on the lines of what the colonial armies had, which had these lal bazaars, for example, which serviced the troops in times of, encampment, siege, warfare, and so on and so forth, in terms of sexual services that were rendered by women.
Thank you, Professor Nair. Innovation, cartography, women, bazaars. Okay. I'll also try to keep my answers brief. The first question, I have two quick answers. One is that, yes, there were innovations like the Mughals learned in Bengal, for example, how to fit cannons on boats and fire them from boats. Now, we don't know how they learned it. It's possible that the Portuguese who were there, not on the official venture, but as pirates and renegades, it's possible that they taught them. But the Mughals really used them up in the rivers, where again the Portuguese did not reach that much. But I will quickly give a second answer to this, say that a lot of military history is guided by the question of innovation. And because for 16th, 17th century world, a lot of the innovation happened in Europe, it becomes a way to say, this is how the West conquers the rest. So the innovation discourse sort of sets the tone to how we should judge an empire or a kingdom in terms of its military abilities. I would say, why is it necessary? Innovation is not the only way to conduct war or even sort of be good at it. The Mughals were very good at it for 2 centuries, even as they were not the best innovators. The second question about cartography is that my answer would be that 16th century was a time when across the world, the 16th century was a time when all the other kingdoms and empires were creating maps. And that was helping them in their administration and their conquests, etc. But here in the Mughal Empire, we have an exception. Barring some maps that were created not at the Mughal court, but by a random nobleman posted in North India, we don't have a lot of maps that came out of the Mughal court. I know that some people are working on Mughal maps right now, and maybe some stuff would come out of that. But as the field stands now, we know that the Mughals were not using a great deal of maps. And as an example among contemporary polities, they were still describing the realm through text, literary text. They were describing it in different ways. But that description gives us a sense that they were aware about the ecology, agriculture, natural features. The third point about women is that there is quite a bit of absence of women in the field of work, especially in the domain of war. And I really envy historians who work on Europe, for example. John Lynn has written a book on women and warfare in early modern Europe, and we don't have anything comparable, at least for the Mughal Empire. We do know about courtly figures, princesses and stuff, but I understand that that's not what you are talking about. There are bits and pieces. Dirk Kolff has written about the women who would wait for the men who went away to be the foot soldiers. And by studying the Baramasa songs, she has sort of tried to understand what the women went through as the men departed for service. And finally, about bazaars, I would say that the Mughals left it all to the Banjaras, the itinerant grain merchants of South Asia, who moved with thousands of bullocks, supplying grain, salt, vegetables across the length and breadth of South Asia. And in most of the army encampments, there would be such a bazaar from where soldiers would buy things. About sex workers, for the 16th, 17th centuries, I have not found any references. But people who work on the 18th century point out how they had become important by that time. My guess is that there was a prehistory to that. And this very important service, they must also have been rendering earlier. Although, like the manual scavengers, we might not have information about it. Thank you.
So given the level of interest, I think we could go on all evening, but I have space for one last question. That lady at the back next to Amana, I'm sorry. I think we are completely out of time.
Okay, I've already framed my question so that I don't go out of the way because I have like a lot of questions. So my question touches on the complexities of reconstructing history, especially when considering underrepresented voices. So, how do we navigate the scarcity of sources and the potential bias in historical narratives, like those found in Akbarnama, while referencing? Also, can we consider verbal accounts, if left any, and autobiographical sources as honest representations of the past, despite selective inclusions and exclusions as per elites and their needs? So specifically for marginalized groups like manual scavengers, as you mentioned, and farmers who were part-time farmers and also soldiers in need. So in that case, ultimately, my question stands that how do we reconcile the dominant narratives which are shaped by the elites with the untold stories of the everyday people, which is quite recurrent in your answer that we do not have much sources left. So in that case, as historians, because what we have been taught is to consider 4 to 5 sources together and consider one story at a time. So in that case, I want to understand your perspective towards that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's true. We historians struggle with this problem of, as I was saying, lack of information in different cases. I'll again keep my answer short, and I will say 2 things. One is that it is possible to cull out certain pieces of information that maybe other people have not paid attention to. And a large part of my work is that I do not look at sources that other people haven't looked at. Most of the sources I work with, people have been working with for 100 years. My only contribution is to look at it using a new lens, asking a new set of questions, and thereby trying to uncover some of the new information that we get. And I do find quite a bit of information, even as Professor Nair was saying that where is the story of the women? It is absent. So I cannot claim to be telling the entire story, but I can try to tell some of it. And the other point is that is about what you asked about the nature of the sources. Everything is written by an author or painted by a painter. Everything is a product of that time and a product of that author or the painter's mentality or what we call subjectivity. There is nothing beyond it. And now we have 2 options. One is to say that there is no reality beyond these texts. Whatever is contained in these texts or paintings, that's all about the past that we can possibly know of. So we are actually not studying the past at all. We are just studying the texts. And many historians take that route. They only study the internal structure of the source or the politics of representation of the text. And often I find that this kind of work, how is it different from the work of literature scholars? Because many of these scholars do not care to contextualize these texts within the larger social context, which I find problematic. I would say, on the other hand, that we have to try. Even as we know that these things are subjective, that there are agendas that every author is pushing for, like Akbar's best friend, come biographer Abul Fazl, of course says only nice things about Akbar, we have to keep trying. And sometimes, as another historian, Ranajit Guha, has said, that we have to read the sources against the grain, which means that if an imperial text is saying that these bloody rebels, we should probably read it as these very strong and confident fighters. So by reading against the grain, it is possible to surpass, I would imagine, some of these restrictions of the texts. Thank you.
So this brings us to the end of the evening, and I think Professor Pratyanath's scholarship and erudition sort of shines forth in his grasp of the subject and the way of his delivery, not only of the lecture, but of the answers to the questions in many ways. Thank you again, and good evening.